Have you ever wondered or asked yourself, what did Abraham look like? Well, this video will be covering that very question from both a old Earth and young Earth perspective. But before we get too deep into the video, first I want to tell you guys about my social media platforms. So I have a Clubhouse account and we can actually talk to one another on it. I also host Clubhouse rooms every now and then where I might talk about history and genetics of the Middle East and Africa. I have a Twitter page, a Facebook account, and a Facebook page, as well as a Instagram, all titled The Hebrew of Israel. And what I typically do on these platforms is post upcoming videos as well as slides for my presentations. And so just be on the lookout for all of that on my social media platforms. And if you want to support me financially for the channel, you can look at my Patreon as well as my PayPal and my GoFundMe. And with all of that out of the way, let's begin with the video. First of all, we know according to the genealogy that Abraham is a descendant of Shem. Genesis chapter 11, verse 10 through 26. This is the genealogy of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. After he begot Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and begot sons and daughters. And then from verse 10 to 26 it says, Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Ru, Serg, Nahor. Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram. And as you can see on the right-hand side of your screen is a simple genealogy without the verses, but a straight line. Interestingly enough, a paternal lineage, and of course a map showing and displaying Semitic languages. So we will be taking a young earth approach when it comes to the phenotype of Semites, starting from Shem to Abraham. With that being said, let's begin. One of the first approaches we can use when determining the phenotype of Shem and his descendants is by looking at the writings that focus on the phenotypes and look of Shem's descendants. Luckily, we have writings from Hebrews or Jews, Arabs, Muslims, Christians, Persians, and many others that tell us the phenotype of Shem and his progeny. So the first one is the Pekri de Rabbi Eleazar from the 8th century, who says, he being the Most High, blessed Shem and his sons black but calmly, and he gave them the inhabitable earth. So Shem is blessed black but calmly, black but beautiful, and he gave them the inhabitable earth. And this is from Al-Tabri, History of the Messengers and the Kings. This is a Muslim source, and it says, the children of Sam, Shem, settled in the center of the earth, which is between Sadraman and the sea, and between Yemen and Syria. Allah made the prophets from them, revealed the books to them, made them beautiful, gave them a black complexion, luminous, and free of blemish. So this source says that the descendants of Shem are, again, black and beautiful, black and comely. And this is from the Persian historian Tabri. Born to Noah were Shem, whose descendants' colors are a black complexion with a light brownish undertone and a dark blackish brown. So from this source, we get basically 3 different skin tone types. We have a black complexion for Shem's descendants, a light brownish complexion, as well as a dark blackish brown. So that's very interesting. And of course, I have to the right-hand side of the screen pictures of indigenous skin tone maps that kind of can reflect that, actually. And this is from Ibn Abbas, a famous Arabic scholar, who says Allah made the descendants of Sam or Shem and the descendants of Ham black skinned. So from this source, it's basically showing that both the descendants of Shem and Ham, they have similar complexions. They're both black skinned. They both seem to look the same. And this is from the 13th century historian Ibn al-Abri or Bar Habrakius, who says, Shem, the land of the browns. And so he is saying that, Shem has brown skinned people. As we can see, according to Hebrews, Arabs, Muslims, Christians, Persians, etc., many of them say Shem's descendants were dark skinned, specifically ranging from light brown to medium brown to even black skinned. This is very fascinating because this gives us an idea from an ancient perspective how Shem's descendants could have looked. This means the people from Shem to Abraham could have been dark skinned, somewhere between light brown to black in complexion. So now let's look at the Natufians. Now, when it comes to the biology of Natufians, we know that it is believed that Natufians are the ancestors of Semites. From a younger perspective, I believe that they are the descendants of Shem. Natufians would represent the early descendants of Shem. Therefore, Natufians are a great source to look at when determining the ancient phenotype for Semites, beginning with Shem to Abraham, or Eber to Abraham. This is from In Hot Pursuit of Language and Prehistory, and it says, this paper makes an additional inference, since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant. That would include your Israelites. And so here is the area of Natufian culture, basically beginning from the Negev near Sinai all the way up to Syria and northern Mesopotamia. And as you can see on the right-hand side of your screen is a reconstruction, a forensic reconstruction of a Natufian. And so this is from the New York Times, a paper that came out in 1857 dealing with the Natufians. And it says, they were clearly a Negroid people, said Sir Arthur, with wide faces, flat noses, and long, large heads. They may have been ancestors of the Arabs or Semites of biblical times, in Sir Arthur Keith's opinion. That's very interesting because this is following along with the Israelites descending from Natufians. And it says, in addition to these riddles, Sir Arthur Keith propounded another linking them unaccountably to ancient Ur of the Chaldees and the prehistoric man of South Africa. But a strange coincidence, he said, at the time of the burnt remains came to me. Leonard Woodley sent me a box of human remains from under the foundation of Ur. These burnt bones from Ur of about the third dynasty also represented not ordinarily cremation of dead bodies clothed with fresh, but cremation of dry bones in the remains from Ur's women's bones were preponderated. And this is interesting because we know that Abraham comes from Ur of the Chaldees. Genesis chapter 11, verse 31 through 32. And Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarah, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to Haran and dwelt there. So in the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So it's interesting how these Natufian remains seem to be linked to Ur of the Chaldees and even, prehistoric man in South Africa. So it's very interesting. So this paper right here actually deals with the Natufian phenotype as well. The questionable contribution of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age to European craniofacial form. And so it says, it is a further surprise that the Epio-Paleolithic Natufian of Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm was assumed to arise, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa. Interestingly enough, however, the small Natufian sample falls between the Niger-Congo group and the other samples used. This placement suggests that there may have been a sub-Saharan African element in the makeup of the Natufians. As shown in Figure 1, the Somalis and the Egyptian Bronze Age sample from Nequata may also give a hint of a sub-Saharan African component. So as we can see on this chart, Niger-Congo and Natufian are very close to one another. And on this chart, Natufian is in between Niger-Congo and prehistoric/recent Northeast African. So in conclusion, if the late Pleistocene Natufian sample from Israel is the source from which that Neolithic spread was derived, then there was clearly a sub-Saharan African element present of almost equal importance as the late prehistoric Eurasian elements. So Natufians phenotypically look very sub-Saharan African. And I think common is a very good example of what a Natufian would look like in the flesh. Just looking at Common's features and the Natufian's features, such as the nose, the cheekbones, the lips, the forehead, the eyes, it all seems to, and the shape of the head, both seem to look very similar. So phenotypically, Natufians basically looked African or Negroid. This means Abraham's ancestors, Proto-Semites or pre-Proto-Semites, could have looked something like that. They could have had somewhat of an African look to them. Perhaps even Abraham, depending on how homogeneous his ancestry is. So this is very interesting. But continuing with Proto-Semites from, anthropological or biological perspective, this source contribution to the history of Iran says that in a private communication, he writes that this sequence is correct for Mesopotamia. As for example, at Kish, where the Mediterranean Proto-Semite is under the Sumerian Alpine, he adds that the primitive Mediterranean type equals the Galas, etc. of Somaliland and Kenya colony, in which in turn equal the Proto-Semites. So basically, what the source is saying is that Proto-Semites look like Galas from Ethiopia or people from Kenya. And this is what early Proto-Semites looked like. They would have looked basically African. It's very interesting. So here's Kish, by the way, just in case you want a visualization. Kish is in modern day Iraq in Mesopotamia, and basically in the center part of Iraq, or a little bit to the south center of Iraq. One of the most ancient, oldest Semitic civilizations where we're getting these bodies from. And so now let's turn our attention to Mari, which is another old Semitic civilization. So Mari was an ancient Semitic city-state in modern-day Syria. It flourished as a trade center and hegemonic state between 2900 BC and 1759 BC. As a purposely built city, the existence of Mari was related to its position in the middle of the Euphrates trade routes. This position made it an intermediary between Sumer in the south and the Ebelite kingdom in the Levant in the west. And so as you can see, there's a map of Mari. It encompassed a very wide area. And on the bottom is a mural from Mari showing what the people look like, how they depicted themselves. So let's get a bit closer image. So as we can see, we see brown skin tones, dark brown skin tones, dark hair, and I would definitely assume dark eyes when it comes to the people of Mari. There's more murals from Mari. Here is one from the Palace of Mari in Mesopotamia, early 2nd millennium BC. Here is another mural from Mari in a royal palace This one also goes back to the second millennium BC. Dark hair, dark eyes, dark skin. Here's another fresco from Mari, Syria. And when I put them all together, I would say that these people would be a dark brown skinned people with black hair and dark eyes. And of course, I have to the far left hand side of the image people who are brown skinned, dark haired, and dark eyes. I would say that this is sort of what they could have looked like in the flesh. So, the depiction of proto Semites from ancient Semitic civilizations in Mesopotamia, based on the remains we found, resemble, I would say, African or Ethiopic peoples. Abraham came from the region of Padad Amram, uh, slash Amram Nehoram near Syria. So now let's look at the people in ancient Syria in this time because it was a very mixed area. Although many peoples lived in this land, there was an ancient Semitic inhabitants that was described by writers as being very dark skinned, specifically basically black in complexion. Not only are there depictions, but there are also descriptions of these black Syrians slash Arameans by other local peoples, such as the Assyrians and also foreign peoples like the Egyptians. So there are descriptions and depictions. So this is where I believe Abraham would have lived. He would have lived in Kasdim and in Syria near Amram, as you can see. And let's deal with the descriptions. So this is from Henry Skersey, who says the white Syrians whom Strabo places in this region must be Hittites. Indeed, there are specially contrasts with the black Syrians, who are said to live east of Armenus and must consequently be Arameans. So basically, east of Armenus, there are a group of black-skinned Syrians who are called Arameans. And so here's the Armenus Mountains, and he said it's east, so it'll be in this locality. And of Kasdim would also be east of the Arameus Mountains, because this is where the Arameus Mountains would be, and it'll be towards the east in the similar geographical region that Abraham would have been in, such as Padad and Maram. So let's look at the people of this region. So it says the Chaba Arabs, the present possessors of the south of the more southern parts of Babylonia, are nearly black, and the black Syrians of whom Strabo speaks seems intended to represent the Babylonians. So of course Strabo even spoke, a Greek historian even spoke of these black Syrians, or these black Syrians, and even connects them to Babylonia, the southern parts of Babylonia as well. And by the way, that was from the greatest empires and civilizations of the ancient world by George Rawlson. And here's another quote from a dictionary of Greek and Roman geography. It says, Lycio Syri, the ancient name of the Syrians inhabiting Cappadocia, by which they were distinguished from the more southern Syrians who were of a darker complexion. So again, from various quotes, we do see that there are two types of Syrians. I'm not saying that every single Syrian is black. According to these quotes, there are two types of Syrians. You have lighter skinned Syrians that seem to have been a little bit more north and west. And then you have the darker Syrians who seem to be a little bit more south of Syria and a little bit more east of Syria. So it wasn't just all dark skinned. There was definitely lighter skinned or whiter skinned Syrians. But basically what I'm alluding to is that there's two types of Syrians in ancient times, according to the Greeks and the Romans. So here's a depiction of the dark-skinned Syrians or Arameans. This is a fresco from Tel Barship, and this is the king of Assyria actually conquering these peoples, and they are obviously a dark brown-skinned people with seemingly locks of hair. Yes, I would say that's locks of hair. And here is Tel Bechiris, the region where this king of Assyria conquered these Syrian or Aramean peoples. Very close, of course, to the area that Abraham would have lived in Ur of Kasdim, where all these people are said to have been dark-skinned Syrians. So it's very interesting. And so you can actually find this fresco at the Louvre Museum. They have it there. And again, they depict these light-skinned Assyrians attacking these very dark-skinned Syrians or Arameans um, who have well, a dark brown complexion, black hair with locks. Here's a little closer image from inside the museum, someone who took a photo. And also, the Egyptians depicted these dark-skinned people in Syria, Bedouin people in Syria from ancient times. You can find this at the Global Museum, the Global Egyptian Museum.org. The description, as you can see right here, head of a Bedouin from Syria, and it says the description, head with brown red skin, and it goes into the rest of it. But yes, this is from Egypt, ancient Egypt. Another one from Syria. This is the Global Museum, the Global Egyptian Museum.org. Again, head of a Bedouin from Syria, and again, head with brown red skin. And this is again from ancient Egypt, dealing with Syria. Some of the inhabitants, some of the people they captured. And so when you put all these images together, both the depiction by the Assyrians and the depiction by the Egyptians of these dark-skinned Syrians or Arameans, you kind of do see a very interesting commonality between them all. First, the skin tone. Obviously, both ethnic groups, the Assyrians, when they depicted these people, and the Egyptians, when they depicted these people, depicted them dark brown skinned. Furthermore, they depicted them with these locks of hair, which I found to be very interesting. The Assyrians depicted them with locks of hair, and the Egyptians depicted them with locks of hair. Furthermore, they also depicted them with these hair. I almost want to say not a crown, but like a head wrap or type of a type of band around the head. I'll say a band. So the Assyrians depicted these groups with bands around their heads, and so did the Egyptians. So I find that to be very interesting. How in two different parts of the world, in Assyria and Egypt, they're depicting these black or these dark-skinned Syrians or Arameans very similarly. It's very interesting. So Abraham could have looked like these quote unquote, black or brown Syrians, since he comes from that part of the world of Padad Amram and Aram Nahor. So, according to the scriptures, Abraham was from Ur of the Chaldeans. Now, although Chaldeans didn't exist in Abraham's time, when the writers of the Torah needed to update certain parts of the scriptures with the modern audience, they typically did that a lot. They may have used the word Chaldean to explain who Abraham was or where Abraham came from. You find these updates often in scripture. In scripture, another example, a quick example I'll give is using the term Para Ramses when it comes to the Exodus, but originally that region was the Avaris or Goshen. That's just a quick example. That was an update in scriptures. But anyways, with that being said, understanding who these ancient Chaldeans are could give us a hint into what Abraham could have looked like. Ancient Chaldeans have been described as looking like Elamites, which is really interesting. This is even a tradition. There's even a tradition in the Book of Jubilees that Arphaxad, an ancestor of Abraham, married an Elamite. So, Genesis chapter 11, verse 27 through 32, it says, "This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begot Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in his native land, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarah, his son Abram's wife. And they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to Haran and dwelt there. So this book is Prehistoric Nations by John D. Baldwin. So he says, the region known as Susnia was politically connected with Chaldea from the earliest times. It was occupied by people of the same race, who in the course of time may have developed a Susnian dialect of the common language. This region was probably inhabited in the distinct first colonized in the this region was probably included in the district first colonized by the Cushites. Its ruins are of great antiquity and show plainly their Cushite tongue. So basically, John D. Baldwin is saying that the people of Susnia and Chaldea are from the same race. And Susnia, by the way, is the capital of Elam. So let's go into that. This is another quote, but it's by A.H. Skazy, talking about ancient Babylonians. He says, as however, M. Defoe's excavations on the site of Susia have brought to light inbuilt bricks of the Elamite period, on which a black race of mankind is portrayed. It may mean that the primitive Sumerian population of Chaldea was really black-skinned. So basically saying that, when it comes to the primitive population of Chaldea, that the inhabitants could have been black-skinned based on M. Defoe's excavations and what he found when it comes to the Elamite period. And so this is from The Negro in the New World by Sir Henry H. Johnson. He says, the Elamites of Mesopotamia appear to have been a Negroid people with kinky hair and to have transmitted this racial type to the Jews and Syrians. An evident Negro element is in Babylonia. It is possible that in or the verge of the Verge of Arabia, the ancient basal stock of the generalized Negro divided into two streams of divergent immigrations, one to proceed to Europe via Syria and the other to pass through Arabia to Egypt and tropical Africa. In Arabia or in Egypt, it may be arose the difference between the long-headed African Negro. But the main thing to get out of this is the fact that the Elamites of Mesopotamia, they looked like a Negroid people and they had kinky hair, and there was a Negro element in Babylonia. And interestingly enough, it may have been passed to the Jews and the Syrians. But the interesting one is the Syrians because, of course, Abraham coming from what we just talked about, Abraham and the dark-skinned Syrians. That part is very interesting. But the Book of Jubilees says, or there is a tradition, should I say, in the Book of Jubilees that Arphaxad married an Elamite. So Elam named Susnia, whose daughter Reshunia married Arphaxad, progenitor of another branch of Semites. Sushan, or Susia, was the ancient capital of the Elamite Empire, mentioned in Daniel chapter 8, verse 2. So you have Arphaxad, an ancestor of Abraham, marry an Elamite, according to the Book of Jubilees. And here it is right here, Book of Jubilees, chapter 8. Arphaxad took to himself a wife, and her name was Ashrajeah, the daughter of Susia, the daughter of Elam. And forgive me for my mispronunciation. So, with Arphaxad marrying an Elamite woman, what do Elamites look like? And as you can see on your screen, this is Elamites. Clearly, they are a dark brown skinned people with, as the writers say, a kinky curly hair, and I can see why that they would quote unquote call them Cushites, even though they're not Cushites, these are Semites. But even when it comes to their quote unquote gods, they also depicted them dark brown, reddish dark brown skin with kinky hair. Here are more images of Elamites on the walls of Elam with their spears and their arrows, their bows and arrows, depicted very dark skin, all of them with very kinky curly hair, wearing headbands as well. Here's another image of Elamite gods depicted just like the Elamite people with brown, dark brown skin and very kinky curly hair, thick, bushy hair, both for the gods and for the men. And here are more images. They depicted themselves like this over and over again. There's a lot of them. This is why a lot of old anthropologists were like, these people are clearly either Cushitic or that they're Negro, but these are definitely Semites. They're just dark-skinned Semites. It's simple as that. And there are plenty of images of these dark-skinned Elamite people, black hair, dark eyes, dark brown skin, etc., etc. So the Chaldeans are represented as looking like Elamites. That's what I want you to get from this. Chaldeans are said to look like Elamites, and furthermore, an ancestor of Abraham. If we take the book of Jubilees to be true, an ancestor of Abraham mixed with these people or got with these people. So Abraham could have looked like an Elamite. The Elamites, even though they are Semitic, they are described as looking African. Therefore, Semites from Shem to Abraham could have looked African, either Negroid or Cushitic. Now, with the nativity of Abraham being Ur of the Chaldeans, it is likely that the writers connected Abraham to Chaldeans of their day. If this is so, what did ancient Chaldeans specifically look like? So now let's look at the Chaldeans themselves, the ancient ones. Again, reiterating this verse, Genesis chapter 11, verse 27 through 32. This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begot Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in his native land, in Ur of the Chaldeans. So, remember what was said about the Chaldeans when it comes to the Natufians. They may have been the ancestors of the Arabs or the Semites in biblical times, in Sir Arthur Keith's opinions, talking about the Natufians. Furthermore, it says, in addition to these riddles, Sir Arthur Keith propounded another linking them unaccountably to ancient Ur of the Chaldeans and the prehistoric man of South Africa. So the Natufians seem to biologically be linked to Ur of the Chaldees, which is interesting. So again, Natufians is another great example of how Proto-Semites could have looked, how Abraham could have looked, and his people. And of course, when it comes to Natufians, it is a further surprise that the Epio-Paleolithic Natufian of Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm was assumed to have arisen, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa. So there you go with that. So now let's look at the Chaldeans. Let's specifically go to them. So according to Smith's Bible Dictionary, it appears that the Chaldeans were in the earliest times merely one out of many Cushite tribes inhabiting the Great Alvum plain, known afterwards as Chaldea or Babylonia. So according to Smith's Bible Dictionary, Chaldeans may have been a Cushite people, and of course Cushite is a very flimsy term. Basically, they're saying that they could have been black. And let's look at more quotes dealing with Chaldeans. So this is from History of Ancient Civilization. This is by Charles Sosgobos. Excuse me. The Chaldeans in the plain of the Euphrates. They were peoples of sedentary and peaceful pursuits. Their skin was dark, the hair short and thick, and the lips strong. Some terms them Cushites, others Hamites. So interesting. Again, we're seeing that Chaldeans are sort of being represented as a African-looking people, dark skin, thick, short hair, strong lips. So it's very interesting. So this is from Prehistoric Nations by John D. Baldwin. He says all the best qualified investigators agree that the evidence already obtained shows conclusively the Cushite or Ethiopian origin of Chaldea. So yet again, we see that Chaldea is being represented uh, with a African look of people, Cushitic or Ethiopian type. This book is a book of the beginnings, volume 2 by Gerald Massey. And he says the primitive Chaldeans and Babylonians were known to the Greeks by the name of Chaldeans and Kephians. The Kephians were synonymous with Ethiopians. So yet again, we're seeing this connection with African peoples, with Chaldeans. And so this is from The Beginnings of Civilization by Charles Woodward Hudson. He says, the Cushite Arabians and possibly the Chaldeans are the founders of the first historic civilization in Babylonia, being certainly Hamitic, though early mixed with Semitic tribes long before the Assyrian rule. So yet again, we're seeing Chaldeans being connected to Cushite Arabians, which could be your Joktonites, and being, connected to Hamitic peoples, which is very interesting. So here is actually a depiction of Chaldeans. This is from University of Cambridge, Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. And this is Chaldean soldiers with a certain group of captives. I'm not going to reveal who the captives are. I'll touch on who those captives are later. But here are the depictions of Chaldeans. This is a depiction by the Greeks. As you can see right here, this is the Greek language. And so this is from the 11th century. So here's a closer image, by the way. These are Chaldeans. And looking at the Chaldeans, they do pretty much fit what those writers were saying, how, Chaldeans are. Dark-skinned, short, thick hair, and they look, quote-unquote, Ethiopian or quote-unquote Cushitic or quote-unquote Hamitic because they're dark-skinned. That's what a lot of those old anthropologists mean, by the way, when they say, oh, Ethiopian or Cushitic. Chaldeans are a Semitic people, so they're not Cushites or Hamites, they're Semitic. But they look Hamitic is basically what they're saying. And I will agree, they're dark-skinned. They're clearly a brown-skinned people with dark hair and dark eyes. So, with that being said, it's highly likely that Abraham could have looked like these ancient Chaldeans. Ancient Chaldeans looked African, so Abraham could have looked African. Simple as that. So Abraham could have also looked like the Joktanite Arabians. So let's get into the Joktonites. So Joktanite Arabians would technically be the most ancient / closest relatives to Abraham. Joktan was the son of Eber and the brother of Peleg. This makes Joktan and his descendants closely related ethnically to Abraham, ethnically. Therefore, genetically speaking, indigenous Arabians have the highest amount of Natufian ancestry. Joktonites are considered to be pure Arabians. A great example of Joktonites that Abraham could resemble are the Sabaeans. So just to do a quick recap on Joktan. Joktan, Quoktan, Koktan. Joktan's descendants are called Joktonites. There is an Arab tradition that Joktan was the ancestor / progenitor of all the pure Arabian tribes of Central and Southern Arabia. ATS Bible Dictionary, Joktan, son of Eber, and by him connected with the Hebrews and other Shemitic families. he is believed to be the Khaktan or Yaktan, to whom Arabian writers trace their purest and most ancient genealogies. Easton's Bible Dictionary, there is an Arab tradition that Joktan, Khaktan, was the progenitor of all the purest tribes of central and southern Arabia. So here's just a visualization of the lineage. So we have Eber, and his sons are Peleg, whom Abraham would descend from, and eventually the Israelites. And then he has another son named Joktan, and these will be your Joktanites, and here are his sons. Famous people such as Sheba, Ophir, and Havilah. And these Joktanites would be the most ancient relatives to Abraham that we can glean from, and of course the closest. So Joktanites would be a good example of how Abraham could look. So now let's actually look a little bit deeper into the original Arabian population. So this is from a book, The Arabs, by Bertram Thomas. He says, the original inhabitants of Arabia, then, according to Sir Arthur Keith, one of the world's greatest living anthropologists, who has made a study of Arab skeletal remains, ancient and modern, were not the familiar Arabs of our own time, but a much more darker people. A proto-Negroid belt of mankind stretched across the ancient world from Africa to Malay, giving rise to the Hamitic peoples of Africa, to the Dravidian peoples of India, and to the intermediate dark people inhabiting the Arabian Peninsula. Very interesting. This is from the Negro in the New World. It says, it is quite conceivable that the great peninsula of Arabia was once populated, as far as its natural conditions allowed, by a primitive Negro stock. So many sources are pointing to the idea of a proto-Negroid or primitive Negroid-looking people in old Arabia. This is from Henry Fields. He says, among these Negroid features which may be counted normal in Arabs are the full, rather everted lips, shortness and width of nose, certain blanks in the bearded areas of the face, between the lower lip and chin and on the cheeks, large, luscious, razor-like eyes, and dark brown complexion. That's the key thing, a dark brown complexion, and a tendency for the hair to grow in ringlets. And here's the most interesting thing from Henry Field. He says, although the Arab of today is sharply differentiated from the Negro of Africa, yet there must have been a time when both were represented by a single ancestral stock. In no other way can the prevalence of certain Negroid features be accounted for in the natives of Arabia. So basically saying that there must have been a time when both, seemingly like both the Negro and the Arabian was like one type of population or descend from one type of ancestral population, but they split. And I think that's very interesting. And of course, on the left of your screen, you see Arabs or Arabians by photos taken of them back in the 1930s by Brian Thomas. This is in the Arabia Felix near the Hejaz, so it's very interesting. And of course, when it comes to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the 9th edition, it says that regarding the origin of the Arab race, a third is the name Hamir or Dusky, a circumstance pointing, like the former, to African origin. The fourth is the Hamiric language. The Hamiric language are African in character, often in identity. Indeed, the dialect commonly used along the southeastern coast hardly differs from that used by the Somali Africans on the opposite shore. The pure Arabs, like the Joktanites, differ from that of the north. Sixthly, the pre-Islamic institution of Yemen and its allied provinces, its monarchies, courts, armies, and serf bears a marked resemblance to the historical Afro-Egyptian type, even to Abyssinians, which are East Africans. Seventhly, their physical confirmation of the pure-blooded Arab inhabitants of Yemen, Hadranite, and Oman. Other particulars point in a African rather than an Asiatic direction. Lastly, the extreme fallacy of marriage, which exhibits in all cases, which exists in all cases of the Southern Arabs with the African races. The fecundity of such unions and the slightness of even absence of any caste feeling between the dusky, pure Arab and the still darker native of modern Africa may be regarded as pointing in the direction of a common of a unity of a community of origin. So basically what he's saying is sort of similar to what Henry said, is that, the peoples like the Abyssinians of East Africa and the Arabians on the other side of the Red Sea, the Southern Arabians, seem to have a similar joint union or joint origin. And that seems to be the case when you look at the Jokhtanites. Check out my video on Sheba, son of Joktan, that Jokhtanites actually did go into the land of East Africa. But continuing more understanding of these Arabians, Henry Field in his Ancient and Modern Humans, his book Ancient and Modern Man in Southwestern Asia, says, Dravidian and Arab have in them an inheritance of a common stock, an inheritance which has been retained more completely by the natives of India than by the people of Arabia. So basically saying that even the Dravidians and the Arabs seem to, in their phenotype, have a common link. And on the right-hand side of my screen at the top are Dravidians, ancient Indian types. And so Marshall and von Eifel's remarkable insight has the support of contemporary ethnology and modern genetic research. Sir Arthur Keith and Dr. Wilton Moran Corrigan, in their discussion of by the way the book is called, the racial characteristic of the Southern Arabs, they say, the Arabian Peninsula was at one time occupied by a people intermediate to the Somalis on the one hand and to the Dravidian peoples of India on the other. So basically they're saying that the original Arabian population was something in between a Somali and a Dravidian. And on the bottom of the screen, on the right hand side of the screen, is a Somali. And so basically, like I said, they're saying that the original Arabian population was looking like a Dravidian or a Somali, something like a mix of the two, which is very interesting. And so this is a quote dealing with the Jokhtanites, and it says, the people of Dhofar are of the Joktan, are the Quakhtan tribe, the sons of Joktan, mentioned in Genesis. They are of Hamitic or African rather than Arab types. And there to the right-hand side of my screen is a chief from Dhofar, so that's what they're saying that Jokhtanites look like. And I find this all to be very interesting, how the Chaldeans, the Elamites, the Jokhtanites, the Arabs, they're all being referred to as looking like Hamites or Africans, even when it comes to Proto-Semites from those earlier quotes that I read with the Euro-African. All of these people are saying that they look like Hamites and Africans. And furthermore, this fits perfectly with what those quotes said about those quotes from Hebrews and Arabs and Christians and Persians who say Shem descendants are brown and black, and how Shem's descendants look like Hamites. It all just sort of comes together perfectly. So let's deal a little bit more with the Jokhtanites because I'm not done. This is from Prehistoric Nations by John D. Baldwin. It says, in the traditions, Saba, described as a descendant of Khoktan, is the next personage who represents an important historical epoch. The legends connect him with the southwestern quarter of the peninsula, and with a kingdom that seems to have included Yemen, Hadramaut, and Hejaz, and other districts. Hamir, a descendant of Saba, is another royal personage to whom special but unexplained historical importance is attached. So, this is from African presence in early Asia. It says the Encyclopedia Britannica gives a description of the physical qualities of the original Arabs, and it says, who will be Joktonites, and it says the the inhabitants of Yemen, Hadramaut, Oman, and the adjacent districts, in the shape of the heat color, length, the slenderness of the bones, and scantiness of the hair, point to an African origin. They claimed descent from Khoktan. These Yemenite kings, descendants of Khoktan and Hamir the Dusky, a name denoting African origin. The general characteristics of the institutions of Yemen bore considerable resemblance to the neighboring ones of the Nile Valley. So basically, they're saying that, these people who descend from the legendary Joktan or Yoktan or Quoktan, they look like or seemingly have an African origin, and they look like people of the Nile Valley. And this quote right here, this is early the nations of the southeast, early Israel and the surrounding nations by Archibald Skersey, says the people of Sheba belong to the South Arabian stock. In both blood and language, they differed considerably from the Semites of the north. Physically, they bore some resemblance to the Egyptians, and it has been suggested that the Egyptians were originally immigrants from their shores. Some of them crossed the Red Sea and founded colonies in Africa, in the modern Abyssinia, where they built cities and introduced the culture of their former homes. Like the Egyptians, the Babylonians, they were a literate people. Their inscriptions are still scattered thickly along the ruins of their towns, written in the letters of the alphabet, which is usually termed Phoenician. So basically, from this quote, the people of Sheba, who descend from the southern Arabians, which would be your Joktonites, they look like Egyptians, according to the source, which of course is very interesting. Furthermore, they say that these peoples migrated even into modern day Abyssinia, which fits along with your Ethio-Semitic people that I talked about in my video, Sheba, son of Joktan. And there to the right hand side of your screen is ancient depictions of Egyptians. Basically, these people would have been dark brown skinned, black haired, dark eyed. And of course, the description of, Joktonites looking like Egyptians fits along with what Elliot Smith said in his book, The Ancient Egyptians and the Origin of Civilization. There is a considerable mass of evidence to show that there was a close resemblance between the Proto-Egyptians and the Arabs. So it's funny how all these books sort of just follow along. And of course, when it comes to the Proto-Egyptians, they were dark-haired, which was associated with dark eyes and a bronze complexion. They had black eyes and a ruddy brown skin. They had brown irises, brown skin. The iris was black and dark brown, and they looked like people of Northeast Africa. The Proto-Egyptians had a coppery brown skin color. They always depict themselves with a red skin. So this is basically what we're getting at when it comes to these ancient original Arab types. And of course, when it comes to what Elliot Smith said about the Proto-Egyptians, calling them the brown race is associated with, quote unquote, a Negroid type of people. So, and of course, the Euro-African as well is associated with the Negro people of Africa, or closely related to the Negro people of Africa. So it's all following along down a same trajectory, which is these people are dark skinned. These ancient people are dark skinned. So this quote dealing with Southern Arabians, the people of Arabia belong to two distinct and apparently quite different races. The Arabs of southern South Arabia are smaller, darker, and coarser featured, and nearly beardless. All authorities agree that the southern Arabs are nearly related by origin to the Abyssinians, who are your Ethio-Semites. And so Abyssinians are Habesha peoples, and they are a Semitic language speaking peoples mainly uh, who mainly live and reside in the highlands of Ethiopia and Eritrea. And people in the diasporic community uh, typically have adopted the name Habeshas, all referring to all peoples of Eritrean and Ethiopian origin. And by the way, those are images. To the right hand side of your screen is depictions, or well, should I say, an actual image of Habesha people. So that's how Jokhtanites could have looked, and early Semites for that matter. But now let's read more books dealing with Southern Arabians. This is Racial Types from South Arabia. It says racial affinities of the South Arab lie in northeast Africa. A Negroid strain occurs in the belt from Africa through South Arabia to Malaysia, including the Dravidians of southern India. So again, we're seeing that these Southern Arabians, these Jokhtanites, they looking like Africans. And so now let's look at some Sabaean statues. There are Sabaean statues, two male statues. Look at their features, look at their hair. And here is a Sabaean statue right next to an Ethiopian. And when I look at the features, they look pretty much the same. And here's more depictions of a Sabaean with a Ethiopian or Abyssinian. And here's more. And I think that I will agree with these writers who say that Ethiopians are descendants of these Sabaeans. And this is how Sabaeans could have looked. They basically would have looked like your Ethiopians of today, because the features just match perfectly, even when it comes to the women and the hairstyles, and of course the features of the face. So here's just good example of what these people look like. Sabaeans, Ethiopians, Abyssinians, Habesha, all one and the same. So Abraham could have looked like Joktanite Arabians, and Joktanite Arabians looked like Africans, specifically Ethiopic. So Abraham could have looked Ethiopic. Bedouins are another good example, or another good group that Abraham could have looked like. Bedouins, like Arabians, are another ancient indigenous population to the Middle East. Like the Arabians, their closest ancestors are the Natufians. And furthermore, we can find ancient depictions of Bedouins from Syria, where Abraham came from. And Abraham, in a sense, is kind of like a Bedouin because he's a bit nomadic in parts of the scriptures where he's always, where he's wandering from Ur to the land of Canaan. He kind of becomes like a Bedouin in a sense. But according to the genomic history of the Middle East, Arabians and Bedouins are positioned close to the ancient Levantines, which would be your Israelites. It is a further surprise that the Epipaleolithic Natufian of Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm was assumed to arise, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa. So Bedouins are connected to Natufians. And so when it comes to Bedouins, historically the indigenous tribal groups or tribal peoples of the Middle East, called the Bedouins or Bedouari, have often been excluded or overlooked compared to the settled populations within the Levant region. And as you can see at the top is Bedouin boys, two Bedouins, quite dark skinned. And here's a Bedouin head from Syria. Just want to re-show you that when it comes to the Bedouins of ancient times, they too are dark skinned. Two Bedouins depicted by Egyptians, and these Bedouins were situated in Syria. And here are 18th century drawings of Bedouins. This is a young Bedouin girl, a nomadic Bedouin pastoralist in the Negev, the Sinai Negev, Syria. And their features are, to say the least, interesting. when it comes to the hair and the face and the skin tone. And here are pictures, old pictures of Bedouins. Again, these are clearly a dark-skinned people. And here are more depictions of Bedouins, but these images are a little bit more colorized. And as you can see, they are still quite dark-skinned. These are Bedouins in Jerusalem, as a matter of fact, in Israel. And here is just more Bedouins. This is from the Jordan, which is a neighbor to Israel. It's in the Levant region. And Bedouin girl and a Bedouin camel herder. And here is Bedouins from Oman, specifically. This is another part, but this is in Arabia. And so the Al-Rashid southern tribe, the Al-Rashid is a Hadwi or Bedouin southern tribe and seems to have been part of the Bart Karith tribe in the past. Forgive me for my mispronunciations for the last words and the words coming up. The Rashid were among the most isolated of the tribes in Oman, living in the far reaches of Darfur. And Darfur, by the way, was what the early writer said that Joktonites looked like. It says, with little interaction with the outside world until the second half of the 20th century, they are still considered to be one of the few pure Bedouins. So that's interesting. So people in this region, the Al-Rashid Bedouin tribe, are considered pure Bedouins. So let's look at what these people look like. So here are Bedouins of that type. Bedouin Bats Kathri are the Bedouin Rashid, as they said right here. The Al Rashid are the Bats Kathri. Bat Kathri, Bedouin Rashid. So this is what they look like right here. This was images taken in the 1940s. And let's get a closer image. So this is what these Bedouins, these quote unquote, pure Bedouins look like. And again, we're dealing with a very dark-skinned people and dark-haired people. And here is the Rashid tribe, the Rashidia tribe, as they said earlier. And again, we're dealing with people who are quite dark-skinned, medium brown to very dark brown. Al Rashid, this is a family of them. Here is a Rashidi boy, brown skin, brown eyes, brown hair, or dark hair. Here is a Rashid man, Bedouin. Here is a Rashid in Saudi Arabia at a camel market. And here is again in a camel market in Saudi Arabia, man, a Rashid on a camel. Here's Rashid men having breakfast, and as you can see, they're quite dark-skinned Bedouin people. And here are two Rashid people having a gentleman's disagreement, I would say. And that's Rashid man. So just a closer image. So Abraham could have looked Bedouin. Bedouins are typically dark-skinned, dark-haired, and dark-eyed. Abraham likely had dark brown skin, dark hair, and dark eyes. And basically, I would say, that's what, Abraham could have really looked like. So now let's look at the Greek and the skin tone map. There seems to have always been an understanding that the Middle East had dark-skinned inhabitants. The Greeks recorded this. Furthermore, if we look at indigenous skin tone maps of the world, you can clearly see what the complexion of people would be based on UV maps. So this is from Ethiopia and the Origin of Civilization by John G. Jackson. And it says, in ancient times, Ethiopia extended over vast domains in both Africa and Asia. It seems certain, declares Sir E.A. William Budgen, that classical historians and geographers called the whole region from India to Egypt both countries inclusive, by the name of Ethiopia, and in consequence, they regarded all the dark-skinned and black peoples who inhabited as Ethiopians. Mention is made of Eastern and Western Ethiopians, and it is probable that the Easterners were Asiatics and the Westerners Africans. In addition, uh, Bulgin notes that Homer and Herodotus call all the peoples of Sudan, Egypt, Arabia, Palestine, and Western Asia and India Ethiopians. Another classical historian who wrote about the Ethiopians was Strabo, from whom we note the from whom we quote the following. I assert that the ancient Greeks, in the same way as they classified all the northern nations with which they were familiar as Scythians, etc., so I affirm they designated as Ethiopians the whole of the southern countries towards the ocean. Eudorus says that the Egyptians were considered as occupying all the southern coasts of both Asia and Africa, and adds that this is an ancient opinion of the Greeks. And so this is from A History of Ethiopia, Volume 1, Nubia and Abyssinia, E.A. Williams Budgel. And he says, though the country of Ethiopia is frequently mentioned by classical writers, Homer, Herodotus, Strabo, Diodorus, Philippi, and others, Homer speaks in the Odyssey, the Ethiopians uttermost of mankind, these eastward statutes, those towards the west. These extracts only show that Homer thought that they were Eastern and Western Ethiopians. From these various statements, we may conclude that Homer and Herodotus called all the peoples of the Sudan, Egypt, Arabia, Palestine, and Western Asia and India Ethiopians. Homer invented the name Ethiopia and Ethiopians. As Herodotus, Strabo, and Philippi connect Ethiopia with Egypt. And there is no doubt that the earliest classical writers considered to be Ethiopians, all the peoples who were swarthy or brown-skinned or black-skinned, including the Negroes, and the country in which they lived, whether the Sudan or Western Asia or India, to be Ethiopia. So basically, people from Africa to the Middle East to India were all called dark-skinned people. They were all called Ethiopians, which is basically dark-skinned. And just to give you the Greek understanding of Ethiopia, it means to be burnt face, basically dark-skinned. The sun kissed these people. The sun kissed these people. The sun, it touched these people. It made them dark because, when you burn something in fire, like a piece of paper or wood, it turns dark. It turns to ash. So that's what they mean when someone's an Ethiopian, that they're a burnt face person. And so, just to give you a quick understanding of Ethiopid, Ethiopids are characterized by very dark skin with a reddish tint, tightly curly hair, narrow, high nose, a tall, slender stature, and long heads and face, marked chin, thick lips. Besides affinity to other sub-Saharan Africans, they are linked to early Caucasoids who partially left and migrated back to Africa. So that's the Ethiopid phenotype. So here's a skin tone map dealing with UV radiation and what indigenous peoples would have looked like, had migration not occurred and things like that. This is what the natural skin tones of people would be. And this is here's a UV understanding when it comes to the heat of the world and the coldness of the world. As you can see, where it is red, purple, blue, red, and yellow, that's where people will be kind of dark skinned and brown. And as we can see, it kind of overlaps with the Middle East. Indigenous peoples of the Middle East would have ranged from a light brown to a medium brown to a black complexion. Kind of like what most of these quotes have been saying. And basically, when it comes to type 4, brown skin rarely burns with sun exposure. That fits with the Middle East, and it's common in the people of the Mediterranean descent. Now, when it comes to dark brown skin, very rarely burns with sun exposure, common in the people of the Middle Eastern descent. And I agree with the basically type 4, type A, and type 6 being that Mediterranean, that brown Mediterranean, or brown Euro-African, or brown Middle Eastern type, which fits along with the skin tone map and fits along with this understanding. Type 4, light brown to tan skin, dark hair and eyes. Type 5, dark skin, dark eyes, dark hair. And then type 6, very dark skin, dark eyes, and dark hair. All of this would be your ancient Middle Eastern types from Shem specifically. And basically, when it comes to the descendants of Shem, the early Semitic inhabitants, this single image basically summarizes my thoughts when it comes to the Proto-Semites and the descendants of Shem, ranging from basically light brown skin tones to medium brown skin tones to dark brown skin tones and to even black skin tones, because obviously you can have black skin tones in the Middle East. So this is what the early descendants of Shem would look like, having various facial features, by the way, as well, especially as time goes on and depending on who you mix with. So these are the early descendants of Shem. And here's the global map of indigenous skin tones, what the skin tones of Shemites would have looked like in the earliest of days. So therefore, since the descendants of Shem to Abraham lived in the general region of the Middle East, I would say that they could fit into the black and brown category of people recorded by the Greeks. And we can clearly see this when we look at UV indigenous skin tone maps. So, Shem to Abraham phenotype. To conclude, what would the Semites from Shem to Abraham look like? From everything we covered, 1. The description of Shem's descendants are black and brown. 2. Description of Natufians, Negroid phenotype. 3. Description of Proto-Semites, Negroid or Ethiopic phenotype. 4. Eber and Azurat, all Hebrews have Cushite, Hamite ancestry. 5. Syrians and Arameans are depicted and described as black, east of Armanus. 6. Chaldeans and Elamites described as Negroid or Ethiopid. 7. Chaldeans described as Cushitic/Hamitic looking. 6. Joktanite Arabians described as Cushitic and Hamitic looking. 9. Proto-Arabians described as Proto-Negroid or Primitive Negroid looking. 10. Bedouins, phenotypically black to brown skinned when it comes to Middle Easterners. And 11. Greeks said that peoples of the Middle East looked like Ethiopians, and 12 UV maps show that indigenous peoples would have looked brown and black. I didn't add 11 and 12, but went ahead and said it. Based on all of this from a young Earth perspective, and technically you can even use this for an old Earth perspective, but based on a young Earth perspective, I would say that Proto-Semites from Shem going down the line to Abraham from the genealogy would have looked somewhat African, but also Arabian, but with a visual representation of what Semites and what Abraham could have looked like using everything we covered. Here's basically the summary. This is how Abraham and early Semites could have looked. Everything on one nice image. We have the Chaldeans, the people of Mari, Syria, the Black Syrians or Arameans, the Elamites, the Black Bedouins of Syria, and the Sabaeans and Abyssinians. Everything on one image. So this is how I would say, early Semites, how I would say Abraham could have looked like based on everything we covered, just dealing with ancient populations alone. This is the best example that I can provide. So, as stated before, I would say Proto-Semites from Shem going down to Abraham from the genealogy would look somewhat African, but also Arabian. After all, early Asiatics looked African, and early Semites were believed to be Africans. Early West Asians resemble Africans, sources at the top. A comparison of craniofacial features of major human groups. And here is from a conversation with Christopher Eritz. After all, the early Semites were just a few Africans arriving to find a lot of other people already in the area. And as we know, Shem, he is the ancestor of Semitic peoples. And Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are descendants of Shem. Therefore, I would say Abraham could have looked something like this. To summarize, dark-skinned, medium brown to black, black hair, dark brown eyes. Simple as that. That's how I think Abraham would have looked, as well as Isaac and Jacob and the 12 sons. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the 12 sons would have looked dark-skinned, either medium brown to black, black hair, perhaps curly or wavy, and dark brown eyes. And this is the image I would say Abraham would have looked. I think biblical Abraham will have looked something like this man right here. This is my best example, I would say, for Abraham. So this concludes the video. What did Abraham look like from an old earth and young earth perspective? Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, please leave a comment down below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video, and click the bell. And follow all of my socials for more information, or to contact me that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. And with all that out of the way, have a great day. Shalom.